So I'm really excited to introduce our lecturer, Janet Catherine Berlo. She's the professor of art history at the University of Rochester, has a PhD in the history of art from Yale. She's the author of Quilting Lessons, Notes from the Scrap Bag of a Writer and a Quilter, and Wild by Design, 200 Years of Innovation and Artistry in American Quilts. She was a founding member of the International Quilt Study Center and has authored numerous books and exhibition catalogs on the arts in Americas. And she's a popular lecturer and a quilter, and she's part of our QBL community. She's taken classes with us before, and we just love to have Janet around. So I'll pass this to her, and she's going to talk.
Thank you, Ivana. I'm so happy that you invited me to come tonight. I wasn't able to take a class this summer, but here I am anyway. Because this gathering has been a very happy place for me so many summers over the last 20 years. Now, this evening I'm not giving an academic lecture. I want to fill your eyes and your brains with the eloquence of women's textile arts, with examples drawn from over 6,000 years of history and about a dozen different world traditions from Europe and Africa and the Middle East. I'm not doing Asia because we'd have to stay too late and you need to go to bed early so that we can get up and be artists. And as I will try and show you tonight, and as some of you already know quite well, quilters have long taken inspiration from other worlds and other art forms, and I want to encourage you to do this even more. I'm focusing tonight on the issue of abstraction in art. For those of us who studied European art history, or for anybody who's picked up an art book in the last 50 years, the story goes like this. In the second decade of the 20th century in Paris, artists such as Pablo Picasso and Juan Gris, both of them Spaniards, and the Frenchman Georges Braque decided that realism and naturalism had run its course. It was time to break up the picture plane. They turned their back on illusionism and embraced the two-dimensionality of the canvas. The result, as we know, was Cubism and all the subsequent modernist movements that encompassed the very famous arts of the 20th century. But actually, scholarship over the last 50 years has told us a different story, but a lot of the culture hasn't caught up yet. As many of you know, in 1971, Jonathan Holstein and Gail Vanderhoof mounted the revelatory exhibit Abstract Design in American Quilts at the Whitney Museum. This groundbreaking show offered historic American quilts as the bold precursors to the modernist works of abstract painters such as Barnett Newman, Piet Mondrian, and Joseph Albers. It set attendance records at the Whitney, got widespread media attention, and toured both North America and Europe. This exhibit and its small catalog and the subsequent book, The Pieced Quilt and American Design Tradition, were pivotal in opening the art world's eyes and those of the general public to the inherent worth of quilts as eloquent art objects. As some of you know, Jonathan Holstein was a longtime friend of QBI and the quilt shows at the Schweinfurth, although he left Casanova, New York for California several years ago. Jonathan argued in this exhibit and in countless public lectures that, and I quote, "an important body of American design has been overlooked." And the impetus for his show was, in fact, his friendship with Barnett Newman and other New York abstract painters. He lived in New York at the time, and he noticed that many of them had quilts, American quilts, abstract quilts, on their beds and on their walls. So he demonstrated the ways in which 19th century American quilts had anticipated a visual tradition that had been overlooked. And so when he discussed quilters' creativity in geometric patterning, he wrote, "Quilt makers arrived at many visual results similar to those obtained by artists painting as much as a century later." This was a revolutionary thing to say in 1972. But from the vantage point of 50 years later, and an awful lot of feminist scholarship, I would argue that the only thing wrong with it was that he didn't go far enough. Today, many of us are thinking and writing about the fact that since antiquity, women seem to have been the preeminent abstract artists. If it's for me, I'm busy. Teri Greeves Greeves is a wonderful Kiowa bead worker and co-curator of a big exhibit you may have heard of, The Hearts of Our People, a show of Native women's art that toured the country several years ago. I was on the advisory board of that, and it was quite a revelation putting together a show that was the first ever blockbuster show of Native women's art. And Teri would say over and over again, abstraction is a female language. Abstraction is a feminine language, is the word she used. And her background as a Kiowa, that's from Oklahoma on the Great Plains. And of course, the preeminent women's art forms on the Great Plains are quill work. Historically, there's not that much quill work anymore, although it's made a comeback in the past 30 years or so, and beadwork. Now, I want to know who first looked at a porcupine and said, I could make it out of that. Because porcupine quill work is a very demanding and labor-intensive art. You have to hunt the porcupine, kill it, pluck it, wash the quills, sort them, dye them, flatten them, usually pulling them through your teeth until they soften, and then make art. So even though, to our eyes today, beadwork looks and seems like a labor-intensive art, the women who first encountered beads didn't think so. They thought it was very labor-saving, because to flatten quills and sew them down with sinew, buffalo sinew, as you see in the bottom left there, or more recently, people tend to use thread. This was very, very labor-intensive. But these hanks of beautiful European beads that came with the first traders and filled trading posts across the West, these were revolutionary. So beads came from Venice, cloth and metal came from England and France, and in 1832, the first order sent to St. Louis to fill the storerooms of the newly built Fort Pierre on the upper Missouri River listed among the items desired 1,500 pounds of blue and white glass beads, 50,000 white and purple shell beads, 5,000 needles, 2,000 awls. So that, along with all the things that we think of as trade goods, guns and mirrors and all sorts of other things. Materials for the making of art was a big part of what went up the river in those steamships. So by the end of the 19th century on the Great Plains, durable beads virtually replaced the truly labor-intensive work of quill work. And from the east, across the Great Lakes region, and into the west, women's arts were fundamentally changed and enriched by the wealth of new materials brought with the fur trade. Clothing, footwear, bags, regalia for horses, regalia for people, all of it was adorned with beads, most of it in very bold geometric patterns. Beads transformed the objects that women made from early 19th century restrained use of color and pattern to entire bodices being beaded, and sometimes even entire dresses. This wonderful dress in the storeroom of the Smithsonian, made by Minnie Sky Arrow, and she was a concert pianist, and it is said that she played the piano while wearing this. I want to tell you, this dress weighs about 40 pounds. I can't imagine it. Now, the conventional understanding of Native women's art in the early to mid-20th century literature is that they were, quote, limited to the repetitive designs typical of craft processes like beading, basketry, and weaving. And I spent a long time reviewing the literature from the late 90s, because I'm a pedantic scholar and I do stuff like this, reading what scholars had to say from about 1880 up to about 1980 about the arts made by men and arts made by women. So, for example, there was a very influential show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1941. Indian Art of the United States filled the entire building of the Museum of Modern Art. It was a landmark exhibition. But the catalog states that men were the artists, for painting by women has always been restricted to abstract design. And yet in the anthropological literature by people who lived with Native people, they never said anything like that. They never found anybody who said anything like that. So at the same time that some of these experts are talking about, women are restricted to the geometric palette of the beads there, and you see that same kind of beaded bag on the horse done in the much more cerebral and important work of painting done on the by men. So as the prestige of abstraction within European and Euro-American modernism grew to the middle of the 20th century, these contradictions embedded in what critics said became even more apparent. So Barnett Newman himself, who we were just talking about as somebody who had American women's quilts on his bed and on his walls, in 1947, he organized a show of Native art for the very influential Betty Parsons Gallery in New York. And he remarked of a male Native artist's figurative painting on hide, the everyday realities he left to the toy makers, the pleasant play of non-objective pattern to the women basket makers. So the female artist finds herself caught in a web of contradictions, just like the female artist does in every society in the world, it seems. For her, what is the pleasant play of non-objective patterning is a limitation, but when performed by a male abstract painter like Barnett Newman, it's an elevated art form. Well, at a certain point, we began to have kind of cognitive dissonance with this, right? So these texts were written at a time when, for the Euro-American artist, abstraction was seen as the highest intellectual and artistic achievement. Well, it may be or it may not be, but if it is, for the male Western artist, let's also say that it was the highest intellectual and artistic achievement for Native women artists for hundreds of years, too. So, and I think we begin to see how absurd it is when we start to invert some of these statements. So if I say male artists were limited to the relatively simple historical and narrative modes, for only women had the power to break through to the cerebral area of great abstract art. And Joe, we have no animosity for you. You're one of us, so,
He's broken.
you can be the token male in the room. And of course, this kind of abstract work still goes on and is very important today. Here, a wonderful beaded dance outfit made by a Lakota artist named Jody Archambault Gillette, who at the time that she made this before she was in the Obama administration. I'm getting ahead of myself. But she's a very accomplished woman. She's a consultant now for many businesses in Washington, D.C., but she was a special advisor to President Obama in Indian Affairs and danced with this dress on at powwows before it was shown at the Metropolitan Museum in the Musée Quai Branly in Paris. And there is a wonderful artist who's come to the forefront in the last 7 or 8 years named Diane Whitehawk, a Lakota woman who lives in Minneapolis, a MacArthur Fellow, wonderful painter, art school trained, of course, but she says that her main influence in terms of abstraction is the quill work and the bead work of her female ancestors, whether she is combining them with paint, as in this painting. She has a huge ceramic tile installation just this year at the Whitney Museum, and you see her in her Minneapolis studio. And so the art world is beginning to catch on to this. It's been really quite a pleasure for me in the last couple of years to see so much contemporary Native art go into those museums, and so much art by women in particular. Now, of course, the other great textile art of abstraction in North America is Navajo weaving, a tradition that brings together the knowledge that Navajo women got from their Pueblo neighbors who lived in that area of the Southwest first, and taught Navajo people how to weave. The wool that came with the Spanish conquerors and some of the technology from New Spain that came up into the Southwest. There are many Navajo textiles that look like modern paintings. This one on the right has always been a favorite of mine. They're They're done on vertical looms that you sit down cross-legged in front of, and we'll see different kind of looms for other weaving traditions in a minute. But, beautiful, bold abstractions that, look fantastic on the wall, although curators and Navajo people themselves remind us that these were wearing blankets. They were seen three-dimensionally around a human form, and sometimes they're shown that way in museums now. But they're also knockouts when you see them on the wall like this. These very plain, bold ones from the mid-19th century are called chief's blankets, not because the Navajo have chiefs, they do not, but these were widely traded among other native groups. And here you see a painting by Carl Bodmer in the 1830s showing a man of the Great Plains wearing a chief's blanket because it was a very high prestige item. And so many of these, I've looked at Navajo blankets in which I'm sure that some of the weavers had seen quilts. I put up a show of Navajo weaving in St. Louis about 25 years ago from local collections, and there were a couple that just were almost dead ringers for quilts because, of course, Native women made quilts too, and Native and white women had interactions across the Southwest throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. But, I think if we all claim this as our legacy as textile artists, and think about the bold use of color and the bold use of pattern, and maybe there are certain things that you can take from this and put into your work this week, even if it's just sort of the tiniest juxtaposition of one color against another, or whatever. And, Navajo weavers, as I said, didn't do this in a vacuum. They learned from their Pueblo neighbors. They learned from weaving saltillo serapes that came up from northern Mexico. But also there was a very strategic movement on the part of a couple of traders at the end of the 19th century who said, how do we get these beautiful rugs into the homes of middle and upper middle class women in Philadelphia and Boston and Washington and so forth? They'll have these Middle Eastern carpets on their floors. We know, we'll show pictures of Middle Eastern carpets to Navajo weavers and say, make them look more like that, and maybe these people will buy them. And in fact, it worked. Of course, the technique is entirely different because except for kalims, which are flat weaves, most Middle Eastern carpets that were in use at the end of the 19th century anyway in people's homes were tufted, like you see on the left, whereas the Navajo rug is a flat weave. There are lots of different regional styles, and then there are individual styles that don't correspond to any particular region. It's one woman's vision or one family's vision. But here, something that's called the ganado style, and in fact, this red is often called ganado red because you see it so often in those rugs. And these women certainly understood, as much as anyone learns in art school, how to understand the visual play of and the optics of different colors for your eye and how to do movement. And then in the 1870s and 80s, there was another sort of revolution where they got Germantown yarn from the mills in Germantown, Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia. Beautiful, already dyed aniline dye, so women didn't have to dye their own. And again, it's like with quilt work, they didn't have to raise the sheep, shear the sheep, clean the wool, spin the wool, weave the wool. They just had to do the last couple of steps. And so there was this huge new, very imaginative use of color and pattern with this very fine Germantown yarn. And just like with quilts, sometimes we see samplers that just show the virtuosity of the weaver. And again, abstraction is a feminine language. Another Navajo style, 2 Gray Hills, the most famous and most accomplished woman who did this was a weaver named Daisy Tavlici, and I had the privilege of being in a storeroom at the Hurd Museum when we were choosing objects for the Hearts of Our People show, and the blonde woman with her head looking over the rug is Jill Yo, a specialist on Navajo weaving, and she was just so reverent in front of this particular weaving because Daisy Tavlici was also an expert spinner, and her rugs have about 100 weft threads per inch versus the normal 30. It's a little bit like saying, well, a hand quilter who does 3 stitches an inch or 10 stitches an inch. And again, even within the Two Gray Hills tradition, you get lots of different variety, just as with any American quilt pattern, you can see 22 log cabins, and each one will be different and each one will be amazing. So too with these regional styles. Here's Lola Cody, who won a blue ribbon for the best of textiles at Santa Fe Indian Market in 2012 for this amazing, enormous rug woven from her own sheep. I was a judge at Santa Fe Indian Market that year, but I wasn't a judge of textiles, so I can't take any credit for her winning this. So these traditions live on, whether you live in Albuquerque or Phoenix. A lot of Navajo women who are professional women still do this. She learned to weave when she was 5 and has been weaving her whole life. And remember the name Cody because we're going to see her daughter's work in a couple of minutes. Now, just as I mentioned that Jonathan Holstein figured out that many modern painters in the 1950s through 80s collected and lived with American quilts, it was equally true that many important mid-century American artists, among them Jasper Johns, Donald Judd, Kenneth Nolan, and Frank Stella, collected Navajo textiles and were undoubtedly influenced by them. And this was argued in the pioneering 1972 traveling exhibition catalog, The Navajo Blanket. I don't have a slide of that exhibit, but this is a later stand-in for it. And that catalog was one of the rare instances in the 1970s when women's arts were accepted on their own terms and celebrated as the equivalent of any contemporary art. The catalog's authors were Mary Hunt Kallenberg, who was a textile curator, and Anthony Berlant, a Los Angeles artist, and they wrote, "Abstraction was not a special artist's vocabulary for the Navajo women who wove these blankets. It was simply a valid means of personal expression in their society." Now, just a little commercial in between my talking about abstraction. Here's a commercial for something else. So the wonderful thing about Navajo weaving, it's really part of a whole Navajo philosophy of life. The Navajo philosophy and epistemology is one of the great living systems in the Americas. And there's the idea of doing everything in beauty. The Navajo word for beauty is hoso, there on the bottom. And one anthropologist wrote that it's not possible to translate hoso with one English word because our language is poverty-stricken. The English language is poverty-stricken when it comes to putting these ideas together. Beauty, harmony, goodness, rightness of mind. So as you're doing your quilt work, think about the fact that when a Navajo woman who's been properly taught does her work, thinking beautiful thoughts, not worrying about debt, not worrying about illness, but thinking beautiful thoughts because she wants to imbue beautiful thoughts in her weaving. And there's a special prayer as you finish the weaving that says, "It is finished in beauty." And a Navajo prayer that one says every morning facing the rising sun is, "With beauty before me I walk, with beauty behind me I walk, with beauty all around me I walk," etc. And here is this elderly Navajo woman with all of her beauty surrounding her. I do have one man in this exhibit. There are male. There's always one. There are a few expert male Navajo weavers. Probably foremost among them is Marlo Catoni, who does these really quite extraordinary rugs. And he and Melissa Cody, the daughter of Lola Cody, who I showed you a few minutes ago, have really been getting a lot of attention for their work the last 10 years or so. with really rather wild designs that combine abstraction and figuration. And museums have been collecting their work. Here are two by Marlowe and two by Melissa Cody. There was a big piece in the New York Times a few months back about her work, just as there was a big piece this past April about the beadwork of Teri Greeves. And these things always make me so happy that native art is no longer just off on the sidelines the way it was for such a long time. Melissa Cody had a big show at PS1, which is the Museum of Modern Art's art space in Queens. And so she's getting a lot of attention. Now let's go further south and further into the past and think about how the structure of weaving promotes experimentation in abstraction. Of course, you think of the horizontal warp and the vertical, the vertical warp and the horizontal weft leads you naturally to abstraction. And that's true whether you're talking about Egyptian linen woven to 2040 BC, or even older textiles from Israel, or textiles from Peru. And so let's look just briefly, again, for visual inspiration in abstraction at some Andean textiles from Peru and Bolivia, both ancient and modern ones. Western weavers are very, they feel very reverent about the weaving tradition of the Andes because it's the most complex weaving tradition in the entire world. And as you see here on the right, they also did shibori, although they didn't call it that. We think of shibori as being just Japanese, but ancient Andean weavers did it as well. So these particular textiles, which at first glance to me look so much like Navajo rugs, but they are much smaller. They're woven in cotton from the Nazca culture and the Paracas culture in ancient Peru. And these, the only reason we have these is that they were buried in a very arid area along the coast of the Andes, and so they lasted to the present. We have very few examples of ancient North American textiles. We don't know what most of them were like. But these are extraordinary inspirations for quilters. And here, this tie-dyed and pieced tunic from the Wari culture. This is at the Textile Museum in Washington. It is both pieced and tie-dyed. And some people are very familiar with the Royal Inca tunics from just before the coming of the Europeans to the Americas. Very bold, abstract textiles woven by women. The most famous of which is the Royal Inca tunic, or as I call it, the Royal Inca tunic, owned by Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. I worked at Dumbarton Oaks for a year in the 1980s, and when I was feeling gloomy or if I had had too much paperwork, I would go up to the gallery and just stand in front of this beautiful, beautiful thing and try to imagine how someone had masterminded that. A colleague of mine recently wrote a whole book about this textile. It just came out a couple of months ago. And he determined that two weavers working side by side did it, with perhaps the expert weaver working on one side and her apprentice working on the other side. But it, again, like the samplers that we looked at, it's a kind of master inventory of all of the patterns that these weavers knew. We know much less about ancient Maya weavings, but we have some aspects of them available to see on textiles, like this lintel in the British Museum from a site called Yaxchilan in Mexico. And you can see much better in the line drawing what the kneeling royal woman, what her tunic looks like. And interestingly enough, in that part of Chiapas today, women still weave on their backstrap looms very similar sorts of textiles, both ancient Andean weavers and ancient Maya weavers and modern weavers in both of these areas use the backstrap loom, which is very easy to roll up and put away at the end of the day. I did work with Maya weavers in Guatemala some decades ago, and it was amazing how even tiny little girls know how to weave on these sorts of looms. I had a good education one time when a little girl picked up a loom. I thought, oh, how cute, she's picking up her mother's loom and she's going to pretend to weave on it. Nope, back and forth with the shuttle she was weaving. I thought, okay, shows how much I know. And these textiles are what we call supplementary weft patterning. People who don't know these techniques think they're embroideries. They're not embroideries. These are done right as you are, stacking the wefts across. They are supplementary or extra wefts. And, each village has for a long time had its own traditions. That's been changing some in the last 50 or 60 years. But here you can see a close-up of how, on the right, the red and blue wefts are really just on top of the black weft. You can do figural designs here too, flowers and other things. Some particular villages do that work, but of course it leads itself best to geometric work. Now let's cross the ocean. I could talk about a lot of different African traditions, but I chose just my one favorite, and that is abstract design in the work of Central African women, Kuba women, from the Kuba Kingdom in the Democratic Republic of Congo, what used to be called Zaire. And for those of you who are even older than me, what used to be called the Belgian Congo. It's hard to keep up with all these names. These are woven of raffia, and they are woven by and for royal women. The Kuba are a very hierarchical society. Here's the Queen Mother herself embroidering in the 1970s. And again, wonderful things that are reminiscent of kind of the offbeat phrasing we see in many American quilts and certainly many African American quilts. Some of it is cut pile and some of it is applique. And you see the long horizontal skirt at the bottom right and the individual panels from it. And one of the reasons that I particularly wanted to talk about this is that I studied African art in grad school, so I have that stuff in my head. And the first time I saw a quilt by the French quilter Anne Warringer, I said, oh my God, Kuba textiles. She has looked at Kuba textiles, and there are many of them in France and Belgium in particular. And I haven't kept up with her career, so when I was planning this talk, I called my pal Michael James, because I know he's a good friend of Anne Warringer, and I said, Michael, this is the only image I have of Anne Warringer's quilts. If you have a couple of JPEGs, could you just send me 2 or 3? I want to make this comparison with Kuba textiles. Well, if any of you know Michael James, he's on it, Like the next day he said, okay, well, I seem to have 90 slides of Anne Warringer. And I picked 3 and I turned them into JPEGs for you either. And he knew what I wanted because these are the ones he sent me. So she has looked at Kuba textiles, and she takes often 19th century French linens. If you've ever traveled in France and gone to any of the marketplaces or antique stores, the most beautiful linens, from the early 20th century, late 19th century are there for sale. And she bought these and dyed them herself and made this triptych called Disheveled Totems. And this other wonderful one, both hemp and linen, that she hand dyed. And here are details of those. Thank you, Michael. Now, just very briefly, an area that I know much less about than I know about the things I've mentioned so far. I just want to show you, in case you're not that familiar with them, the work of weavers from the Bauhaus, 20th century weavers in Europe, many of whom came to the Americas, the most famous one being Annie Albers, and she has gotten a lot more attention in the last 30 years, although her husband, Joseph Albers, far more famous than she. As you may know, the Bauhaus was a design school that existed for a very short period, just from 1919 to 1933, first in Weimar, then in Dessau, then in Berlin. And here you see the students in Joseph Albers' famous design class. And the so-called masters of the Bauhaus. We have one woman, Gunther Stolz, whose work I'll show you in a minute. And I put asterisks over the head of her teachers who she said influenced her the most. Vasily Kandinsky and Paul Klee, and you'll see why when you look at her work in a minute. So she was the one female master at the Bauhaus, and her work has gotten more attention recently too, but mostly in European publications. Here, a watercolor design for a carpet, and then these two wonderful things. I think you can see, when you say Kandinsky and Klee were her teachers, I think you can really see that in the one on the left here. And both she and her student, Annie Albers, left many watercolor designs for unrealized textiles, and some of them have been made into textiles in the last several decades. And there are wonderful exhibition catalogs on her works, too, if you want to look more closely at them. I could have met Annie Albers, and I was a stupid 22-year-old, and I didn't. When I was in grad school, Joseph Albers had retired long before I was there, being a painting teacher at Yale. And he and Annie Albers collected pre-Columbian art, I'll say it now. She was interested in pre-Columbian textiles from the time she was a teenager. She saw them in Ethnographic Museum in Berlin and elsewhere. And then when she and Joseph came to the United States after the Bauhaus, they came to Black Mountain College, then they came to Yale. Well, he had the professorship, and she stayed home and wove and wrote her book on weaving. But when I was a grad student, my field was pre-Columbian art and archaeology, and I won the Joseph and Annie Albers Traveling Fellowship for the study of pre-Columbian art. 3 times Joseph and Annie Albers paid for me to go and do research to Latin America. She was still alive, and she lived in New Haven. Why didn't I tell somebody, I want to go meet Annie Albers? Stupid 22-year-old, I didn't. So again, I think you can see, this sort of wonderful, rigorous abstraction, but a kind of offbeat abstraction too. This one she calls ancient writing, referring to the ancient writing of the Americas, things like Maya hieroglyphs and so forth, abstract patterns. And here she is at Black Mountain College in North Carolina in 1937. Her work is owned by many museums, both in Europe and the Americas. This piece in the Art Institute of Chicago. Again, I think a wonderful inspiration for quilters. And this very majestic 6 Prayers that was a commission for the Jewish Museum in New York. I've never seen this in person, but I can only imagine. I don't know the exact scale of it. I think of each one as being kind of human size, but I don't know if that's true. Her famous book, of course, was on weaving, first published in 1965 and dedicated to the weavers of ancient Peru. So just give yourselves permission to draw on this whole 6,000-year tradition worldwide of women who have explored abstraction before you. Go to your stashes. And who among us have stashes like this? Not me. This was, if any of you know Carol Taylor, this was Carol Taylor's stash many years ago. And Teri Greeves, who does as much figural work as she does abstraction. So, take permission to say abstraction is and long has been a feminine language. Thanks very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.